This week in Sharia Talmud, we learned Kiddushin Daf 4a. Over there, we're trying to say that we need both Pesukim to learn both Kiddushin, that the Kiddushin goes to the father, and Masa Yadea, that the work of the young girl, the Na'ara, goes to the father. We need two separate Pesukim. Where do we learn that the work goes to the father? We learn it for Kiyim Chor Ish Es Bita La'ama. Ma'ama Masa Yadea L'Rabba Af Bit Asbas Nami Masa Yadea La'avir. That's what it said on Daf Gimel Amud Beis. It says in the pasuk Yimchor, when a man sells ish as bita, when he sells his young daughter, la'ama, to a slave. So why do we have to say when he sells his young daughter to a slave, it has an extra word ama, and ama means a slave girl. So they're just like a ama, about the slave girl, so the work of her hands goes to the father. So too a man's daughter, the work will go to the father. That's what we learn from that pasuk. And where do we know that the Kiddushin goes to the father? The pasuk says, v'yotzechinam, ein kesef. So it says that a girl goes out. She goes out for free without any money. Ein kesef la'adon zeh, v'yesh kesef la'adon ocher. She goes out from this slave master by a regular slave, but when she goes out from her father's house, well, the father gets the money that the Kiddushin goes. So those are the two Pesukim. Comes along Kiddushin on Daf 4a and says, it's tzricha. You need both of them. Why do you need two Pesukim? Why can't you learn one from the other? So the Gemara comes to explain that you need both. It's tzrika l'miktav Kedusha la'aviv, it's tzrika l'miktav Masa Yadea. If you would have taught Kiddushin, you would have said, surely, okay, Kiddushin goes to the father. That's because the girl didn't have to work for it. About Masa Yadea, there's tircha. She works for her money. She works hard. Shouldn't she get the money? Why would they go to the father? And you would not be able to learn one from the other. And if you just would have taught Masa Yadea and you wanted to learn Kiddushin, you wouldn't be able to do that. You know why? I'll tell you why I get Masa Yadea, because I give her money for her Masa Yadea. I feed her, and she gives me her Masa Yadea. It's a deal. But Kiddushin, which comes ma'alma, comes from the outside money. I wasn't expecting such a thing. We'll see in a minute if Peshatim. So I would say, no, I don't get that money. I wouldn't be able to learn one from the other. Rabbi Akiva Ager Baklad doesn't understand the Gemara. He leaves it in the Sirichion. His kash is he doesn't understand. It said in the daf before, it said, Hashta v'yim makabel kedusheya. What? That the father receives the Kiddushin and she should get the money? So you see, clearly the Kiddushin actually belongs to the father. He has rights to marry off his daughter. But who says he has rights for the money? So he doesn't understand the Gemara at all, and he leaves it with Sirichion. Comes along the Ritvah, he also has a problem on the Gemara. He doesn't understand why the Gemara seems to be saying the factor as to why the father receives the money of her work, her Masa Yadea, is because that he has to feed her. He doesn't have to feed her. It says because he feeds her, that's why he gets the food, but he doesn't have to feed her. It's not true. By a young girl, he doesn't have to feed his daughter. After she's 6 years old, he doesn't have to feed her anymore. So how can you say it's the factor as why he gets the money? So the Ritvah wants to answer that the Gemara is going according to the Sof Daisa of man, or really going to man's basic understanding. A man really wants to feed his daughter. He wants to take care of his daughter and make sure she's fine. So it will be a majority of cases the man is going to feed his daughter. It's true there's no obligation, but the Gemara is speaking what man wants to do. The Pnei Yeshua went to give an alternative to the Ritvah, but he wants to answer like this. He says, since work is learned from an ama, which demands feeding, why? Because the pasuk says, Ki yimkor ish es bito la'ama. There's an extra word ama, so we connected the bita with ama. So just like in the Gemara it says, just like an ama receives the Masa Yadea of his worker, of his slave girl, so too will we receive the work of a daughter, and one to learn from the other. But it happens to be by an ama, it really is true. You must feed her. You're obligated to feed your ama. So since work is learned from an ama which demands feeding, you would think that a daughter also demands feeding. And that's Peshat in the Gemara. When the Gemara says you can't learn Kiddushin from work because work you feed her, it's really just a chiluk, it's just a difference, but it's not the siba, it's not the cause. Once the Gemara learns both Pesukim, Kiddushin and Masa Yadea, and we see Kiddushin has absolutely nothing to do with feeding your daughter, so then we can learn that you do not have to feed your daughter in order to receive these benefits. Now there's a machlokas in the Rishonim as to why we cannot learn from work. The fact that the Gemara said as to why we cannot learn Kiddushin from work, her work, is because he feeds her. So there's a relationship going on. Rashi explains that to mean as he has das. In other words, if we would know that he receives her work, we wouldn't be able to know Kiddushin. Why? Because he receives his work because he has his relationship going on. He has das, he has in mind to receive that work because he feeds her. In other words, he feeds her. So that's what the Gemara means when it says that he feeds her. The feeding is the chilek, is the difference. Because he feeds her, he receives her work. It makes sense because he has that in mind. Mashen Kiddushin, he doesn't have that in mind. He has no idea when the money's going to come and when it's going to come. It's going to come out of the blue. He has no idea when he's going to get married. So why should we want to be able to learn that he receives that money because he doesn't have that money in mind? That's what Rashi says. The Rashbah disagrees with that. He says, hey, listen, the simple pshat in the Gemara is it's dependent on the food. It doesn't say anything about his das, what he's thinking. So therefore the Rashbah would rather give an alternative. Why does he receive her work? And what does the Gemara mean that it's because he gives her food? In other words, he gives her food, that goes directly into the work. When he feeds her, gives her a good breakfast, she's going to work better. So I have a chelek, it's like he's a shutaf in her work. Of course he's a shutaf in her work. He gives her food and she works. So of course he receives the money. And if we would know that factor, we want to be able to learn Kiddushin, where feeding her has nothing to do with her getting married. She's going to get married whether he feeds her or he doesn't feed her. It's a sibur cholka, but it's not a direct cause at all. And that's the machlokas between Rashi and the Rashbah in Peshat and the Gemara. Now the Gemara Ketubos talks about another case, a lost object. Where do we know that when a daughter finds a lost object, she has to give that to her father? So the Gemara says over there, Zechai b'mitzia, mishum eva, because of sinna, because of hatred. What does that mean? Rashi explains that since he's not obligated to feed her, if she finds a lost object and refuses to give it to her father, let's say it could be something really big, $100,000, she found it, and now she's refusing to give it to her father, well then, he would say, okay, fine, I'm going to cut you off. We don't want that to happen. So the rabbis came along and made a decree that the father receives the lost object. You see, it's not like Kiddushin, and it's not like her work, which the Torah teaches us that the father gets it. The case of a lost object comes from the rabbis. Tosafoes in Ketubos 46b, Zelchai b'Metzia, has an unstated difficulty. It says, why does it have to be that we have to learn the din that the father gets the lost object from the din d'Rabbanan because of sin or because of hatred? We're afraid that he's going to cut her off. We can learn it from Deraisa, we can learn it from Kiddushin, or we can learn it from the fact that he gets her work, or we can learn it from the combination of those. So Tosafoes explains we cannot learn from Kiddushin. Why can't we learn from Kiddushin? Because Kiddushin is without effort. Kiddushin has no tircha. Of course the money goes to the father by Kiddushin. In other words, if we know Kiddushin, we would say there's a factor there that prevents us from learning. Kiddushin has no tircha. It just comes into her hand. She gets married. The money comes into her hand. And we just pass it to the father. But by Mitzvah, she would have to work. She'd have to pick it up. She'd have to schlep it. It could be an effort there. So there you would say, well, maybe she gets to keep it, and you wouldn't be able to learn it from Kiddushin. The proof will be from the chilek we made from Kiddushin and her Masa Yadea. In other words, we couldn't learn Kiddushin from Masa Yadea because Masa Yadea we also said was a tircha. So we use that same chilek to be able to not be able to learn Mitzia, because Mitzia would also be a tircha, some effort on her part. Tosafoes leaves out the possibility of learning from Masa Yadea. We know that we'd have the same chiluk though. If you would try to learn a lost object from work, you would simply say that he feeds her for the work, but he doesn't feed her for a lost object. The Marshal also points this out in Ketubos, that's why we left it out. He says we want to get to the Ager chiluk, which comes next, which is this. Why don't we learn from the combination of the two? Why can't we say, once you know Kiddushin, and once you know Masa Yadea, so surely you'll be able to know a lost object from a kal v'chomer, all the more so. What's the common denominator between Kiddushin and work? Well, they're both done with her body. Kiddushin is her. Her physical body now moves into the husband's space. And work she does with her hands. So if those things which are connected to her don't stay by her, but go to her father, so all the more so, a mitzvah, a found object, that should surely go to the father because it has no connection with her at all. It should be a kosher cane. So why don't we say that? And we would have to come onto the svara of the rabbis who say we're worried about the father cutting her off. We have a source deraisa from a kal v'chomer. The answer is that both Kiddushin and work have a common denominator on the other hand, which prevents us from learning. What is it? It's that the father receives a loss in both those cases. By Kiddushin, he takes the loss because he loses his daughter. And by work, he has to feed her for that work. So of course in both those cases, he gets the money flows back up to him because he's taking a loss, which is not true by Mitzvah. There is no loss on his part. And since there's no loss on her part, and she found it, let her keep it. Why should it go back to the father? He's not losing anything. Let her keep it. And we won't be able to learn Mitzvah. The Tosafoes HaRosh in Ketubos is similar to the Tosafoes in Ketubos, but he gives an alternative answer. The reason why the father will get to keep the money because also the daughter gains in both those cases. For example, in the case of Kiddushin, she gets married. She's happy about that, so she doesn't mind to give the Kiddushin money to her father. And when she works, she does Masa Yadea, well, she receives food, substance for that. Therefore, she's happy to give the Masa Yadea to her father. But Mitzia, why should she give the Masa Yadea to her father? She's not gaining anything. It's a total loss for her. And that's the alternative answer of the Tosafoes HaRosh as to why we can't learn the lost object from the combination of Kiddushin and Masa Yadea, her work.